Welcome to JS on Politics. I'm your host, Greg Borowski, and here's a look at today's show. The election is ever closer, but is the presidential picture here in Wisconsin any clearer? Meanwhile, from Bernie Sanders to Elizabeth Warren and Donald Trump to, Donald Trump, visits to the state are picking up. We'll preview a story running Sunday that looks at how Act 10 is reshaping classrooms in Wisconsin. We'll look back at the last final end, we think, of the John Doe, and we'll give you our winners and losers of the week. But first, let me introduce our guest, Craig Gilbert, our Washington Bureau Chief, to talk about the presidential election. So, Craig, a week ago we were talking about how it might take a little while for the polls after the first debate to settle in. They have settled in. Hillary Clinton seems to be doing very well in the swing states. What's your general sense of how the race is shaping up at this point?
So Donald Trump had narrowed the gap with Hillary Clinton recent weeks. Started to open up again. Again, find out in the next week or two just how much. But it's back. It's heading back to where it was after the conventions. Advantage Clinton. I think in Wisconsin she remains the clear favorite. We don't have a lot of fresh post-debate polling. We'll start to get some next week, and we'll have a better read on that. But Hillary Clinton, I think, once again kind of has the upper hand in this race. Obviously, it was not a successful debate politically for Donald Trump, and it raises the stakes in the next debate for him to try to reverse this latest trend and turn this thing around.
All right, so let's look a little more closely at Wisconsin. So just yesterday, Bernie Sanders was here in Green Bay and in Madison. We've got other visitors coming. Donald Trump is coming back on Saturday. Is Wisconsin any more in play now than it was a few weeks ago, or what should we take of all the sudden newfound attention we're getting from the surrogates?
Well, I think Wisconsin is still in that sort of second tier of battleground states. We're not a top five battleground. Hillary Clinton is led in all the polling. So you have this sort of mixed bag of indicators. You've got Donald Trump making several visits here, which suggests it's a competitive state. But Hillary Clinton isn't coming here, which suggests the Clinton campaign doesn't think it has to worry too much about Wisconsin. The polling has been close, but consistently in her favor, and neither campaign is spending sort of targeting the state in their broadcast television advertising, which is another good indicator. So it's a mixed bag of indicators. I think that tells you that Wisconsin is one of those states that could turn into a top battleground. But right now, it's kind of in that second tier of battlegrounds where one candidate has a clear advantage.
All right, well, let's bring in the rest of our panel now. We're joined also by Dan Bice, our Watchdog columnist, and Bill Glauber, one of our political reporters. So we had the vice presidential debate this week. Winners, losers, any movement there out of that, do you think, on the electorate?
Anybody who could stay up, I think, won that debate.
They won that debate?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
I think there's two ways, and I did stay up and I watched the debate. There are two ways to see it. One is, the way you traditionally see a debate, who won or lost between the two of them. And I think the general consensus is that Pence did a better job. He was calm, though there were problems. He didn't defend Donald Trump very much, and he did make a number of inaccurate statements. But in terms of presentation and how they did in the debate, Pence was a little better, and I don't know, how did you think Kaine came across?
I thought Kaine was ill-served by what the Clinton campaign wanted him to do, which was apparently to be an attack dog. That's really not who Tim Kaine is. He interrupted way too much in that debate. I think, apparently turned some people off. But he got the message out, which the Clinton campaign has been trying to get out, which is Donald Trump cannot be trusted with the nuclear codes. I think he hammered that point home.
So I think there are two ways to see it. The second way is, did the vice presidential candidates help the top of the ticket? And I think this might be one of the rare cases where maybe both of them did that. Pence probably reassured some conservatives because he had a much better performance than Donald Trump did. And I think Tim Kaine pounded home this message that that Donald Trump has said a number of outrageous things. And there were 4 or 5 times he brought up the tax issue, just a number of other things. So I think people walk away on both sides happy with how.
Well, let me ask Craig to build on that a little bit, because these two, Kaine and Pence, aren't running against each other. Really, they're part of the tickets, and it's the top of the ticket that matters. So, do you think the ticket on either side fared better out of that debate, Craig, or is it sort of a draw, and it really is the presidential debates that'll turn any votes?
It is the latter, especially when you have a vice presidential debate sandwiched between two presidential debates. Obviously, you had a record-breaking audience for the first presidential debate. I don't think you had that for the vice presidential debate. And then we go into the next presidential debate, which is going to very quickly kind of overshadow whatever happens in the vice presidential debate. Paul Ryan was a vice presidential debater 4 years ago. It was an interesting debate. There was a lot of reaction to the way both of those men handled it. But in the end, I don't think anybody thinks it had an effect on the presidential contest.
Well, let's talk about that next presidential debate, which is Sunday night. It's a town hall format. It seems that after this debate, the vice presidential one, people won't just be comparing Trump to Hillary, but does he do better than Mike Pence? Because he did seemingly a better job of making the case than Trump did, right?
Well, they probably took the Mike Pence video and have been showing it to him repeatedly. And it is, something of an odd thing that he's going to be here on Saturday, the day before the debate. And I think, if anything, Mike Pence probably helped himself for 2020 because I think he did better than probably most of the other Republicans who were running earlier this year.
He did well. I mean, he's well versed in television. That came through. And again, I thought Kaine was just in a role that doesn't suit Tim Kaine. I think with the debate coming up Sunday, I've said this once, I'll say it again, the town hall format would seem to be in Hillary Clinton's wheelhouse, to just focus in on one voter at a time. And I think it could present problems for Trump. It's a very difficult format, especially if you're not accustomed to it. And he, clearly, he's still new at this relatively. I mean, this is his first year doing it.
And it could be very important if you remember the Bush-Clinton.
Could look at the watch.
Or look at the watch, but also Bill Clinton really locked in and did really well.
The stool, and he walked toward them, he engaged them, the voters, very directly. So, Craig, let me ask you, pretend for a moment you're coaching Donald Trump on this debate, and I recognize that's an impossible task, but what would your advice be to him in a case like this? What does he need to do? Does he need to get certain points across that he didn't before, or just look more presidential, or what's the goal?
I think Bill is right. You can't fight the format. I mean, the format dictates everything in a debate, so I think it makes it hard to be an attack dog. You've got this audience of regular people sitting in front of you. But if I were advising Donald Trump, I would tell him first to do his homework, be prepared, be more prepared to discuss policy than you were in the first debate, and be more consistent about trying to execute your game plan against Hillary Clinton. He did that in the first 20 minutes of the first debate. I think he's got to be a lot more disciplined about pressing home his stronger arguments, which are arguments for change against the politicians who've been running the country for a long time. But that's the overarching theme. But he's got to fill that in. He's got to be able to articulate on issues better than he's done in the past. I do think the format is a challenge for both candidates because Hillary Clinton has had trouble in some cases, kind of connecting with voters on a human level. The town hall format really kind of requires you to do that in a way. I think she'll have no trouble with the policy discussion, but I think it's going to be a challenge. It'll be interesting to see how she responds to sort of the personal dimensions of the format.
The other thing to watch for is, the key thing in the first debate was how does he respond when she levels criticism at him directly? Does he take the bait or not? Last night, Mike Pence did not, and basically ignored attacks on him and on Trump. Will he respond or not? He couldn't help himself in the first debate.
Yeah. Well, let's talk a little bit about, before we move on here, all the surrogates that are visiting the state. Then, of course, we've got Donald Trump here on Saturday as well. Are there any of these surrogates? How can they be helpful? They put their candidate in the news a little bit.
Well,
but
what they do is, like I saw Donald Trump Jr., he came in on behalf of his father. He roused a crowd in Brookfield, got people excited, then went up to Wausau, got people excited.
He also raised about 150,000 for his father as well.
So you can raise money, and you can also drive people to volunteer, and that's what they're trying to do with Bernie Sanders and with Elizabeth Warren on the Democratic side. Bring out younger people, get them to man phones or, on the phones, get them to help push people to go to the polls. That's why you do these things.
Yeah. So which of the surrogates this week do you think can be most helpful, Dan, of the ones? Is Bernie Sanders? He's obviously did very well in the primary.
It's not just that he did well in the primary, but there still are a few people. There are the never-Trumpers who are still out there, and there still are a few of the Bernie supporters who haven't come all the way around with Hillary. So it's helpful to have him come in and offer a full-throated endorsement.
I think
her.
Elizabeth Warren also helps. I mean, I've seen her work crowds here in Wisconsin. She's very popular with the Democratic base, and both Sanders and Warren were also here on behalf of Russ Feingold, the Democrat running against Republican U.S. Senator Ron Johnson, and I think both of them have been helpful to
all right, well, we're going to leave our presidential discussion there for today. There'll be much more in the weeks to come, but we want to shift now to a special project that's going to run Sunday in the Milwaukee Journal Sentinel that takes a very deep look at Act 10 5 years later and how it's affected the classrooms across the state. We're joined now by two of our reporters, Dave Umhafer and Sarah Howard, to talk about a special project and report coming in Sunday's Journal Sentinel. Dave, you spent a lot of time on this, as did Sarah. It looks at Act 10 5 years later, so everyone remembers the uproar of that time in 2011, but there's been a lot of upheaval since then. So talk a little bit about what you found in terms of what's happening in the classrooms here in Wisconsin.
Sure. There's been a real change in the balance of power in classrooms, in school operations. Teachers lost collective bargaining. They lost their collective voice, and management is firmly in charge. There's been major changes in the way teachers are hired and fired and paid, evaluated, assigned. They've really lost a lot of the influence they had over these kind of internal things, and changes in the way that pay is linked to performance, and merit pay is becoming more in vogue in schools, which is something that not only teachers have fought, but many superintendents have fought as well.
Right. So Act 10, of course, really undid a lot of the collective bargaining, rights and positions for the unions, and give a greater hand to management. But let's talk a little bit about how you guys went about evaluating this. So, Sarah, tell us a little bit about what you did to get to the bottom of what's really happening out there.
Yeah, one of the toughest parts in doing this project was that there's not one solid resource out there, really, with the information that we wanted to be able to say what's happened in schools. So we ended up administering a survey to all the superintendents in the state of Wisconsin, asking about finances, asking about teacher quality, and many, many factors, and ended up getting about half the superintendents to respond to us, and so we could use that to really cut through some of the political rhetoric.
Yeah, we should mention this project was done with great assistance of the O'Brien Fellowship Program at Marquette University, where Dave spent the academic year and Sarah assisted him there. So let's talk a little bit more about some of the particulars. So one thing you discovered as you parsed through all this was that there's signs that districts, sort of the haves and the have-nots, may be faring differently in terms of attracting teachers, retaining teachers. Can you summarize that a little bit?
Sure. A little bit of background. Teachers used to have great protections on pay and on job security that were linked to how long they taught in a certain school district. Those protections are gone, so they're really free to move around now, and teachers increasingly are moving from one school district to another. This has led to a real kind of free agent, free market competition among districts with different financial strengths and weaknesses, different financial histories, more or less ability to approve a referendum. So you really have a new era where money really matters now in keeping your best teachers. And there's kind of a free-for-all out there going on, and it's a whole new world for superintendents. And there's a lot of talk now about districts being divided into this kind of have and have-not grouping.
Yeah, so Sarah, what surprised you the most in terms of the results you found, or was the most sort of striking or interesting thing to you about the project?
So some of the discrepancies that we saw in terms of these haves and have-nots was really interesting. Another thing that was fascinating to me was the difference in views on Act 10 between young teachers and old teachers, and how older teachers who had really experienced that tumultuous time when Act 10 went into effect had much different views on it than young teachers who came into the profession once it was already in place and that was already the lay of the land.
All right. We should note one thing that we couldn't answer, and it really isn't answerable, and I'll ask you, Dave, to explain that in a moment, is the performance and what's happened in the classroom. There's all sorts of reasons why we can't look back and say, well, here's what are students doing better or worse, but why is that?
I mean, the education world is swimming in data, test scores, But there's been so many changes in recent years to what tests the students are taking, a lot of political fights behind that it's really difficult in the short term at least to see and track how districts have done over time. It's just really difficult, and a lot of the effects of Act 10 probably are long-term anyways, so there's not like a black and white answer as to, is a district doing better or worse, and how has Act 10 fared?
And some of that is related to the test changes, and you don't have a baseline from before Act 10 because of that, and so forth. Mm-hmm. So this was a very interesting project. You can find it on Sunday in the Milwaukee Journal Sentinel, and then again next Wednesday in the Journal Sentinel, but also at jsonline.com. So we hope you'll pick it up and take a look. Meanwhile, we're going to shift our attention now to some state issues and talk about the close of the John Doe investigation this week by the U.S. Supreme Court. We're joined now by Patrick Marley from the Madison Bureau, and we still have Bill Glauber and Dan Bice here. So, Patrick, this was the week, finally, right? The John Doe investigation is over, at least per the U.S. Supreme Court, but there's still some legal things hanging out there. Can you tell us a little bit about what lawsuits are still active in the court system?
Yeah, this thing is still going to dry down for a long time. I mean, the investigation is clearly done now. It can't come back to life. But there's a couple lawsuits out there. The MacIver Institute, a conservative think tank, has sued over records that were seized and is trying to get others involved in that lawsuit. And then Cindy Archer, she's a former Walker aide. Her case is before the Seventh Circuit. She's trying to sue Chisholm. That case was dismissed. I think other lawsuits are possible. I think we're going to see a big fight before the state Supreme Court about what happens with these millions of records. Right now they're soon going to be with the Supreme Court, and they're also with some federal courts. Those caught up in the Doe want it to be just with the Supreme Court, and eventually for them to be gotten rid of by all government entities.
Yeah. Well, is there a rationale for that? I'm thinking of other investigations. As a practical matter, does the evidence all get destroyed if there's no charges? But what are we going to do?
No, I don't think so. I think it's pretty typical for police. If they investigate something and they find that it's unfounded or unsubstantiated, they hang onto their records, for a period of time, years, and then eventually, probably get rid of them like any government records eventually get destroyed. But they would hang on to them usually.
Actually, in John Doe 1, I understood they held on to some of it, but they let some of the people that they had taken stuff from to come down and to get back some of their old cell phones,
kind of personal belongings,
right.
Kind of things.
Yes.
Okay. So go ahead, Patrick.
Well, I would say, yeah. I mean, if they take a computer from you, they're going to give it back to you eventually. But if they downloaded things off that computer, that doesn't mean that the investigators get rid of the copies that they've made.
All right. So there'll be more battles on that front. Are there any other prospects of lawsuits against now the prosecutors to say you shouldn't have pursued this or you were overzealous in doing so?
Eric O'Keefe with Wisconsin Club for Growth has been saying that he plans to sue John Chisholm as well, and he said on the radio this week that he felt a moral obligation to remove John Chisholm from his position. It seems like they had their best chance to do that with the election that just happened, but they put up a really bad candidate. So I think they're going to look at other ways to do it. But Eric O'Keefe had said at a conference of ALEC, the American Legislative Exchange Council, that he was planning a pretty massive suit against Chisholm. We don't know the details, though.
It's important to note that would be a second lawsuit against Chisholm. He sued him in the middle of the investigation and made some headway in the district court, and then that case was thrown out by the Seventh Circuit. So it'll be interesting to see what legal theory he comes up with, given that his first lawsuit couldn't get past the appeals court.
Well, let's talk a little bit about the sort of the legacy of the John Doe, because it was been top line discussion for years here. Obviously, a big win this week for Scott Walker, but what's the legacy?
We're doing winners and losers, not you.
I know you guys are going to do winners and losers, but I mean, he's clearly happy. He's not going to have problems here. But what's the legacy of this? What does it change?
I think the bottom line legacy is that there was an investigation, 2 investigations of Scott Walker, and he was not charged or convicted. On the other hand, there's material that's out there that could be used against him anytime he runs for office again, from the lead paint stuff to the Menard stuff to the mining money. I mean, those things are out there, and if he runs for office again as governor or senator or anything else, you can expect that we'll hear a lot about those things again.
Yeah. I think the history books are going to have an amazing time with this because it's part of perhaps the most acrimonious era of politics of modern times here in Wisconsin, and it's all of a piece that, again, with Act 10 and this, I mean, it's truly an astonishing time of Wisconsin public life.
I do think that it's a window into how politics works and how funding of campaigns work at this time, where, we're at a period where the rules for spending money on campaigns aren't really settled right now. So, depending on if this stuff was discovered at an earlier time or later time, it would have had a much different impact on the investigation.
All right, let's talk briefly about another issue that's been percolating this week, and that's the voter ID law. And Patrick, you've been writing about how the DMV employees may not have been properly trained, or now they were said, well, yeah, they were properly trained, but now they're going to be retrained. What's going on there with the voter ID issue?
So this group, Vote Writers, assists people getting IDs, and they went with a voter to a DMV station who didn't have a birth certificate. He got wrong information from 3 different workers. They released that audio, raised some concerns from the judge who's overseeing the lawsuit. He told them to report back. Meanwhile, Vote Writers shared with us tapes they'd made, 10 or 11 other tapes they'd made where a volunteer went in and asked, said they had a friend or a relative who didn't have a birth certificate, could they get a license? And in 7 cases, they were told that wrong information about the ability of that person to get voting credentials. They have things like DMV workers saying things like there are no guarantees. That's not what the DMV has told the court is being told to customers. So they're going to have to explain themselves to this judge as to why so much bad information appears to be getting out.
Right. So right now, though, there's going to be more training being done, or what's the fallout here in terms of we've got an election in just over a month and people are already voting?
So Thursday last week is when the tape first came out. The first tape came out, and the next day the judge, without getting any motions, told the DMV that he wanted a report by this coming Friday. He's now scheduled a hearing for the following week on that. Meanwhile, more tapes have surfaced, and now the plaintiffs have asked for him to suspend the voter ID law entirely, or if he won't go that far, to soften it in ways to help these people who have the most difficulty getting IDs. As the DMV tries to catch up and get ahead of this issue, they announced on Tuesday that they were retraining nearly 400 DMV employees, that they would get an online training module and then have to meet one-on-one with a supervisor to make sure that they understood this. Now, they've told the court before that these people were trained. We find out now that really what that means is they got a couple of memos about how to help these people who have the biggest challenges in getting
Well, we'll be
IDs.
following that issue in the weeks ahead, too, but I want to turn now back to our panel here at the table and their winners and losers of the week. So, Dan, who's your winner?
You already mentioned one.
For the reason you're going to mention.
Well, there are
for
two.
it.
I mean, the John Doe decision is a big win for him. The John Doe's been going on. The first John Doe started in May of 2010, 6.5 years ago, and so right now he can say he's not under investigation by John Doe for the first time in that. And then secondly, he was crowing last night because his candidate, Mike Pence, whom he helped train before the debate, performed very well. The only downside to that is he did so well that some people might think of Mike Pence as being the likely front runner if there's for the presidential race in 2020.
Right, and Scott Walker had played the role of Tim Kaine, right, and some of the prep and so forth.
Right.
All right, Bill, who's your winner of the week?
Charlie Sykes, he's going to retire at the end of the year from WTMJ. He's sort of the undisputed champion of talk radio in Milwaukee. Helped make a lot of careers from Governor Scott Walker and Ron Johnson right on down. He had a falling out with Republicans on the Never Trump movement. He's a Never Trump guy, but I'm sure we're going to hear from him again. But, whether you like his politics or don't like his politics, you have to admire the way he really climbed to the top and helped change Wisconsin and turned it red, in case some people would say for better, others would say for worse.
All right, let's get your loser of the week right away.
Theo Lipscomb, senior at the county board. He got outflanked on the Estabrook Dam, which he wants to keep, and it looks like Chris Abley has finally found a way to knock it down.
That's been
eventually.
Theo's issue forever. I mean, and actually, I think it was his grandfather who was one of the first operators of the Estabrook Dam. So,
all right, and Dan, your loser of the week.
We've discussed this in a little bit of detail. It's people at the Department of Motor Vehicles, the employees who are giving out the wrong information, and obviously the administrators who didn't train their staff sufficiently to tell them what they should be telling people interested in getting IDs to vote.
All right, well, that's our show for the week. We encourage all of you to check back shortly here on jsonline.com and at Facebook Live at 1 o'clock. We'll be doing an editorial board interview with Russ Feingold, the Democratic candidate for U.S. Senate. You'll be able to watch in as he's interviewed by the editorial board.
And us.
And these
We'll
guys.
be there.
They may or may not be the draw. And then we'll be back next week, of course, at the usual time to keep talking about politics here in Wisconsin. So thanks for joining us.